I'm Jim Baxter, and this is a lecture on succession for general ecology. Though the communities we see today seem permanent and unchanging, in fact, they are constantly changing. As we saw in the lecture on community structure and diversity, this was clearly demonstrated by Margaret Davis's work on historical tree migration in eastern deciduous forests. Her work, and that of others, suggest that it's the norm and not the exception that ecological communities commonly experience changes in species composition and relative abundance over long periods of time. One of the key ways that communities change is in response to events like disturbances that can cause wholesale destruction of ecological communities. Though such disturbances like the one shown in this slide, and we Californians are pretty familiar with this kind of scene, though these disturbances might seem destructive, and they are to the individual organisms that experience them, disturbances have played a fundamentally important role in the dynamics of ecological communities over evolutionary time. So much so that over evolutionary time, species have become adapted to ecological disturbance, and in fact, some species require it. In response to disturbance, and because they are adapted to it, ecological communities bounce back and reestablish themselves following disturbance in a dynamic process of recovery and species turnover called succession. Here are the learning objectives for this lecture. As I've been doing, I'll let you take a look at these on your own, but for now, let's continue. Succession is a process of change, a change in community composition, that is the types of species, the abundances of those species, and it's a process of replacement essentially of one community by another over time. Most successional studies have focused on plant communities, but animal communities change as well, and they often change alongside the plant community as the plant community recovers, oftentimes from some kind of disturbance, as I just mentioned. When we describe a succession, that is a sort of a sequential replacement of one community by another over time, we're describing a chronological sequence of events. In other words, a chrono sequence is what this is referred to, of different types of communities. So in this example, we're looking at a change, say, from early conditions that might be a bare field with, short-lived annual species, maybe crabgrass as shown here, horseweed, aster species, and so forth, that would eventually turn into a grassland with grasses and herbs. Eventually, after several years, maybe a grass and shrub type of system with longer-lived perennial species. Eventually, trees, shrubs, and trees would start to colonize, and perhaps, at least in this example, if there was the conditions were such that, like in an eastern deciduous forest, perhaps this might turn into an oak hickory forest after, say, 100 plus years. And this is sometimes referred to as the climax community. In other words, the community that under these prevailing conditions would occur as sort of an end point, if you will, of succession. Each of these stages individually, the grassland, the pine forest, the oak hickory forest here, etc., is referred to as a seral stage. Okay, so that just simply means the particular type of community that occurs characteristically at that particular point in time during this successional sequence. And as I mentioned, animal species correspondingly change, and that's just shown here in this example by illustrating some bird species that correspond with these different seral stages over a chrono sequence. Successions can be observed directly or indirectly. Of course, in very long-lived communities, observing a succession that might take hundreds of years is very, very difficult. which is why sometimes successions are studied indirectly. One example of that is in some early work that was conducted by Henry Chandler Cowles. You can see how long ago that was. Some of his work was first published in 1899. Cowles studied sand dune systems and how plant communities established new communities on the shores of Lake Michigan, where sands would build up and create new habitats, and plant communities would establish new communities in these situations. So in these kinds of dune systems, new sands build up on the shoreline and they create new habitat. And this new habitat is colonized by different types of species. I'm not going to really go into the details of exactly this particular sequence, this chrono sequence, but what Cowles was doing was studying at different distances back from the shoreline. He assumed that the farther away from the shore you went, the longer the time since first establishment of that community. And so what he did was he made sort of what's sometimes referred to as a space for time substitution. That is, the locations closer to the shore are considered more recent stages of succession, whereas moving farther away from the shore, which represents a longer time period since those sands were deposited, and of course, therefore, a longer time period for the plant community to establish, he considered this moving across space as corresponding to sort of a historical sequence. So this essentially is a chrono sequence, but it's represented over space. And so Cowles was really quite insightful to see this, and his is really one of the first studies of succession. But it does illustrate that we can study succession indirectly in this kind of way. There are essentially two types of succession that are recognized: primary succession and secondary succession. The succession that I just described to you on the sand dunes that Cowles was studying is considered primary succession because it's the kind of succession of change in communities that occurs on newly deposited geological material. That is, new material that has not had a previous community developed on it. Sand dunes are a good example of that because for the reasons I just described, with the new sands building up on the shore, creating new habitat to which that can be colonized by plant and other species, bacteria, fungi, and so forth. Other types of primary succession would include new geologic substrates formed by events such as volcanic eruptions, which of course are tremendously destructive and powerful disturbances. But volcanic eruptions basically lay down new habitat in the form of the basaltic material that is spewed out, the geological material, huge debris flows and things like that of mud and mixed materials that form basically brand new habitat that is really devoid of life. And so the new establishment in those situations are considered primary successions because they're establishing on new geologic materials that are virtually sterile. And so these are two examples of primary successions. I want to go into a really interesting example, and this one is in your book, a primary succession that is the result of receding glaciers. And up in Glacier National Park in southern Alaska, near Glacier Bay, extensive studies have been done looking at how receding glaciers basically expose new habitat, and that habitat becomes colonized by species. And so because of recent climate changes and glacial recession, that has been going on for some time. There's quite a long history of a record of different kinds of plant communities and the chrono sequences that we can infer based on where these plant species or these plant communities occur in relation to when the glaciers had receded from those locations. So let's take a look. So the Glacier Bay succession is about a 200-year sequence of succession. And it's due to the fact that glaciers are retreating from Glacier Bay and exposing new geologic material. This is quite similar in some ways to the sands building up on the shores of lakes or oceans that are creating brand new habitat. The glaciers have been retreating from between about 0.3 to 0.4 kilometers per year. And this has opened up new soil substrate that can be colonized by colonizing organisms. So let's take a look at the chronosequence that is happening in Glacier Bay. And the succession in these situations does actually occur fairly rapidly. So let's take a look. This map shows the McBride Glacier Retreat, and the locations of the dates correspond with the edge of the retreating glacier at that time, so that you'll see that the retreat of the glacier nearest the bay, which is at the bottom of the map, occurred around 1760 or so. And as time went on, the glaciers receded further and further up northward towards the top of the map. And so near the top of the map are the youngest, the most recently exposed and therefore youngest plant communities. And the areas to the south or towards the bottom of the map are the oldest areas. So again, the oldest exposed areas near the mouth of the bay at the bottom of the map, and more recent exposures are farther away at the top. So let's take a look at the plant communities that have developed at different times since the substrates were exposed from this receding glacier. So we'll start with number 1 up at the top. This is the youngest exposure, and work our way clockwise to number 4, the oldest exposure. As we go in sequence of time, I'll describe the different plant communities that have developed. In other words, I'll be describing the unique chronosequence for the plant communities in this area as they've established over time since exposure. So the first stage here is what is often considered the pioneer stage. And pioneer because the first species that are arriving are kind of considered like pioneers. And the pioneers of these systems that are the most recently colonized are basically colonized by cyanobacteria and mosses that really start to establish an incipient or brand new soil that allow other plants to be able to root into those soils. So they create some initial soils, and so shallow-rooted herbs begin to establish. And then, so there's a slow development of organic matter. The glacial till, or the rock material that's deposited from the recession of the glaciers, is somewhat acidic, so it creates sort of an acidic, weathered, kind of very highly mineral sort of soil. So this is sort of the first stage that tends to occur between about 0 and 15 years after the recession of the glacier. Between about 15 and 40 years, we start to see colonization by other species, including willows, Dryas. This is a genus of species Dryas drummondii. It's a subarctic perennial kind of woody plant that's kind of mat forming. It's in the rose family, and it's one of the early colonizers. There's also nitrogen fixation by some species of organisms that actually have the ability to fix nitrogen. These are symbiotic mutualists associated with plants in the genus Frankia. Over this time period, of course, the organic matter in the soil is beginning to build up due to the growth and death of plants, shedding of leaves and dying of roots and so forth, begin to incorporate organic matter into the soil. And of course, this enriches the soil and makes the soil more, sort of facilitates the establishment of other plant species. This is referred to as the dryas stage because this plant dryas tends to be very common. After about 35 to 80 years, the soils are continuing to develop, and the systems begin to be established by alders. These are very fast-growing tree species, and they form fairly thick thickets of aspens. They get to be 5-10 meters tall, and they also add nitrogen to the soil because these trees have end-fixing associates with their roots. Soil pH continues to decline due to the release of organic acids and so forth from plant roots in these systems. So you can see that the system is continuously changing and developing as the plant communities establish over time in these areas. Between 115 and 200 years, we get what might be considered a climax forest in this area. It's called the spruce stage because Sitka spruce is the kind of the dominant species of tree that establishes here. There are many other different species of trees as well, and they form a dense mixed forest, and those forests will eventually be gradually invaded by hemlock and some other different species that are very, very shade tolerant. They can establish in these very dense shaded forests. They're very slow growing, and they're also very long lived. So this, in a nutshell, is very typical of a chrono sequence of events that occurs not only in primary succession, that's the example that I explained here, but also in secondary successions that we'll be talking about in a moment. So secondary succession is a type of succession of species turnover, okay, that occurs where there was a previous community. And these kinds of successions are the most common types of successions. And they tend to progress fairly quickly because there are already seeds or vegetative propagules and so forth in the soil from which species can more quickly establish after some kind of disturbance event, or in some cases, like the example that I'm going to talk about here, abandoned agricultural fields. There's already sort of a pool of life that is ready to establish following, at the outset. So let's just take a look at this example here. This is an example from an agricultural field, and you can see in this image, it's an abandoned field, relatively no plant life whatsoever. Between 0 and 5 years, again, this should kind of start to sound similar to the Glacier Bay example here. In the first few years, we get short-lived annual species, herbs, and grasses establishing. Eventually, perennial, longer-lived species, herbs, and even some shrubs begin to establish between about 5 and 15 years. I should mention, actually, that I didn't before, this agricultural field is it's in New Jersey, actually, on the East Coast. So this would be an eastern deciduous forest, ultimately as kind of the climax forest at the end. Between 15 and 30 years, we see a sequence of invasions by longer-lived species, shrubs and trees begin to invade. A lot of them being, say, bird dispersed. For example, the eastern juniper is a species that is very commonly seed dispersed into some of these old fields between about 15 and 30 years after the abandonment. Between 30 and 60 years, we see some sort of fast-growing trees develop. These are softwoods that include red maple and tulip poplar, for example. And so we are getting a closed canopy forest at this stage. And the longer-lived, harder woods are at this point starting to establish as seedlings and saplings. And eventually, after about 60, 70 years or so, we start to see hardwoods develop and replace the softwood species. These forests can continue to grow for several hundred years, in fact, and the climax, that is mature forest for this particular area, would be like a beech or oak forest. So this is again a chrono sequence, but in this case is from a secondary succession in agricultural fields. Another example of a secondary succession, and one that's really quite interesting, is in Yellowstone National Park. So let's take a look at this. This, of course, is a far more destructive situation because it's due to some fires, and enormous fires that occurred in 1988 in Yellowstone National Park. Taken together, the Yellowstone fires in 1988 formed the largest wildfire in recorded history in Yellowstone National Park. Starting as many smaller individual fires, the flames quickly spread out of control, and this was due primarily to the conditions at the time, which were, it was very dry, there had been a period of drought, high winds, and so forth. These smaller fires quickly combined into one large conflagration, which burned enormous areas for actually months at a time, or over a period of several months, excuse me. The fires, in fact, almost destroyed two major visitor centers and destinations, and in September, the entire park was closed to all non-emergency personnel for the first time in its history. Only the arrival of cool and moist weather in the late autumn brought the fires to an end, but by that time a total of over 793,000 acres had burned, and in other words, about 36% of the park had been impacted by these fires. So this was a huge, huge event, and one that hadn't been seen for many, many years. In fact, a fire this large hadn't been seen for centuries. One of the ways, in fact, that ecologists measure fire frequency is in the form of what's called return interval. A return interval is the number of years, on average, that a disturbance will return to the same area. In Yellowstone, fire return intervals range from between about 100 to 500 years, depending upon various different conditions like elevation and other factors that can influence how often fires return to a particular area. It's been estimated that the fire return interval for the Yellowstone fires of 1988 were probably on the order of 200 to 300 years. So a 200 to 300 year event. Given their location and severity and extent, as I mentioned, different conditions will influence the kind of return interval that you'll see in any particular system. Despite its destructive power, however, in ecological systems, fire is actually a natural and ecologically restorative process. It clears dead trees and leaf litter, opens the canopy to allow the sunlight to reach the forest floor, and helps prepare soil for new growth and recycling of nutrients. And as I mentioned, species are well adapted to these kinds of events. So let's just take a look at the Yellowstone chrono sequence. So in the first year, basically, after the fire, a variety of species established. Some of them had not been seen in the park at all. Certain species that respond to fire, which we call post-fire annuals. For example, fireweed is one of them. Fireweed is, as depicted here on the right side in that picture, it produces a beautiful pink flower. They often flourish in years following a fire. Fireweed actually earned its name because it quickly sprouts after fire and other disturbance events. So this flower is common throughout the U.S. And is considered a pioneer species that thrives in open areas and takes advantage of reduced tree canopies, which would be the kind of conditions that would exist after a fire. Other wildflowers as well popped up, including species like Indian paintbrush, lupin, and columbine. These can sprout from underground root structures and so forth. So these structures that are already existing in the soil can really facilitate quick recovery from a fire by these annual species. Another species that is part of an important story here in Yellowstone is aspen. And aspen is an interesting species because it propagates itself primarily through root sprouts, and extensive clonal colonies are common. So it reproduces vegetatively primarily. Each colony, in effect, is its own clone, and all trees in the clone have identical characteristics and share essentially a single root structure. Clones of these trees can turn color earlier or later in the fall than its neighboring aspen colonies, and they kind of do it all together. And so the interesting story behind the aspen is that really aspen up to that point in Yellowstone had really only been observed as these clonal organisms and resprouting. So after the fire, there were plenty of resprouts, but about 5 years later, what was first discovered by ecologists was that aspen seedlings started to show up in many new locations. And aspen seedlings really hadn't been observed in the park up until that point at all. Aspens do produce seeds, so it's not that they don't reproduce sexually, but they seldom grow from them. And so fire appears to have been very, very important. About 5 years out, a different tree species called lodgepole pine, which is a very common species in this part of the country. We have lodgepole pine here too as well in California at higher elevations. Many different many seedlings of lodgepoles and pole pines and saplings start to show their little faces about 5 years out. After about 20 years, lodgepole pine is establishing in pretty dense stands and goes through a process of, if there's enough density, will go through, if you recall, a self-thinning kind of process. After about 60 to 150 years, which is about the lifespan of lodgepole pine, that will be a period where you'll see lodgepole pines growing, that are mature, and these pines can form pretty dense stands that are with trees that are up to about 50 feet tall or so. And so they're starting to shade out the other species and block the growth of much of the ground vegetation. Okay, and this stage lasts for maybe about 150 years. Its flammability is fairly low. There's some dead wood and so forth on the ground, but if it were to ignite, the treetops are too high really to be affected. At about 150 years and out, the original pines, the lodgepole pines, are starting to thin out, and the ground vegetation is starting to increase a bit. Fir and spruce trees start to appear. This stage lasts for about 100 years. And there's a fair amount of green vegetation on the forest floor that prevents large fires until late in the stage, when small trees can provide fuel by which fire can spread up into the canopy and above. So when you start to see, when you have younger trees in the lower canopy with canopy structures above, these can provide sort of fire ladders so that fire can move up into the system. So it starts to become a little bit more flammable at this point. The fourth stage here, about 250 to 500 years out, is what's considered to be the climax community. And that is the community that ultimately would develop under the prevailing conditions. Okay, so these are mature spruce fir forests. The original lodgepole pines are dead or dying, so there's a lot of woody fuel that's on the ground and is abundant. This is probably the most flammable stage. The forest is very susceptible to outbreaks of fire. So depending upon weather conditions, fires can break out if the conditions are right. In other words, drought, winds, and so forth, with lots of dry, woody vegetation as fuel on the ground. So again, a climax community, just to kind of, I'm not sure if I really gave a clear definition of that, but a climax community is an ecological community that's reached the final stage of ecological succession and exists in a relatively stable state for some time until the next disturbance comes along and kind of resets the cycle. So let's shift our attention now to some of the patterns of succession that we see in terms of the kinds of species that occur at different points in time during a chronosequence. In any particular chronosequence, there are, as we've discussed earlier, a set of chiral stages, that is, characteristic stages that a succession goes through. It turns out that and you might have already started to piece this together, that at different stages of succession we have different kinds of species. You might recall that when I talked about agricultural succession, that the first pioneer species, that is the first ones to arrive, tended to be relatively short-lived species, herbaceous annuals, grasses, and so forth, maybe mosses. You might recall in the Glacier Bay succession, cyanobacteria were one of the first, and mosses, and then subsequently herbaceous annuals and so forth. And then later in succession we have much longer-lived species. These kinds of characteristics are illustrated here in this particular graph. This is a graph of a succession that is occurring in an eastern deciduous forest area in an abandoned agricultural field. These data are actually unique in that these data were collected continuously since 1958 until present, and the data are still currently being collected in these old fields. This happens to be data from a study that I was even involved in when I was a graduate student at Rutgers University. And Hutchison Memorial Forest is an area where there previously was agriculture practice there, but the university purchased the land and began to study the recovery of these agricultural fields continuously since from 1958 to the present. And I was involved in the sort of early 90s to mid-90s in some of this data collection. So it kind of makes it an interesting and sort of personal data set for me, one that I was involved in. These data here are the abundances in terms of total percent cover across 4 different types of plant species, from vines to herbs, shrubs, and trees. Each of those different lines represents the abundance over time of those species as they came and went in terms of species turnover in these agricultural fields. So one of the things to notice is that in 1958, when the first data was collected, of course, these were abandoned fields that were in their first few years of succession. And what you can see is that herbs, that is annual herbs or perennial herbs, were the first group to begin to establish in these old fields. But over time, you can see that vines started coming in. Those are the orange That's the orange curve there. As those herbs declined, these other species, vines, subsequently shrubs, and then trees began to colonize these agricultural fields over time. And so you can see, at least for this group of 4 different species, the kinds of turnover that is occurring over time. And what we see is an interesting pattern where the pioneer species, that is the first species that are establishing, are generally rather small, fast-growing, short-lived species. They tend to produce many small seeds. They have very high dispersal abilities, and they're relatively shade intolerant, excuse me. This fits with a certain kind of set of evolutionarily adapted traits that species have that fall under this category of life history traits. And we haven't really talked about life history in much detail. I think I've alluded to it here and there, but in general, species that have this set of characteristics are what are called R species. R coming from basically reproduction. They put a lot of energy into reproduction. That is, producing many small seeds and having very good dispersal abilities means that they can disperse and establish in newly disturbed sites very readily. And you can see that pattern here in their abundance, high abundance relative to other species early in the successional sequence. Later in succession, what we see as the succession moves towards the climax community is that the characteristics of species that are occupying these successional sears, they become more long-lived species that outlive previous species. They're much larger, slower growing. The plant species at least tend to produce fewer but larger seeds that have more seed reserves that allow them to be more competitive in a more competitive environment as succession proceeds. They tend to have more limited dispersal, and they're also shade tolerant. Shade tolerant because, of course, as succession proceeds and species begin to occupy this space and shade it out, when the canopies close in these, for example, eastern deciduous forests and other forests which exhibit closed canopies, shade tolerance is an important characteristic, as is having large seeds with plenty of seed reserves. So these are the kinds of traits that are correspond to the different stages of succession. Species that tend to occur later in succession, closer to the climax community, with this set of traits that I've just described, are generally referred to as K species, that is with a capital K. And this K refers to carrying capacity. So we've talked about carrying capacity. And these are the kinds of characteristics that we often see exhibited in species that occur in relatively stable environments and tend to occur around their carrying capacity. One of the other patterns that occurs during succession is that species diversity increases during the successional sequence. This occurs across both terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems, and also across a wide range of organism taxa, including plants, birds, invertebrates, and algae, as shown here, but also among many others. Initially in a succession, of course, after disturbance, there are very few or no species present, and over time, species begin to accumulate. Ultimately, there's a plateau, and then subsequently a decline. The decline is perhaps due to increasing competition among species where more competitively dominant ones tend to occupy the space, and less competitive ones tend to be competed out of the community. So in some ways, a little bit of a similar mechanism is to that of the intermediate disturbance hypothesis later on in the successional sequence as competition begins to play out. So what are the mechanisms that actually drive succession? Well, there's been quite a bit of research and proposals about what kinds of mechanisms, but one of the fundamental kind of models of succession was proposed in 1977 by a couple of researchers, Joe Connell and Slatyer, who proposed that the traits of the species that precede the later species really fall into three kind of general mechanisms. These are facilitation, inhibition, and tolerance. So let's take a look at each of those and get a feeling for what those basic mechanisms are for driving succession. Facilitation is a mechanism that basically is a positive mechanism that early species actually increase the chance of later species establishing. This mostly applies to primary successions, but certainly also plays out in secondary successions. And to some degree, in some of the chrono sequences we talked about, I've kind of made mention of ways in which this might happen. For example, if you think about the Glacier Bay succession, where early establishing species like cyanobacteria and mosses, in addition to lichens and so forth, are very early initiators of soil formation. And later plant species really, can't do very well unless there's some kind of, incipient or, kind of brand new soil formed so that they can get their roots in and acquire nutrients. So these kinds of species tend to sort of prep the system, if you will, by creating conditions that facilitate establishment of later species. Other kinds of processes as well that are facilitative kinds of mechanisms are in early successional plants, often legumes, in other words plants in the pea family, is that they're associated with nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Rhizobium bacteria occur on leguminous plants, and they are nitrogen-fixing bacteria, and as such, they enrich the soil with nitrogen. Increasing nitrogen can facilitate the establishment by later plants. So these and other kinds of mechanisms fall under this category of facilitation, where earlier species actually change the environment in such a way that later species are able to establish. The second mechanism is a negative type of mechanism, and that's called inhibition. This is where early species actually decrease the chance of later species establishing. The kinds of mechanisms that, in fact, we've already talked about, like competition, predation, haven't talked a lot about parasitism, but that too, are mechanisms whereby if a species has established already, of course, it's going to be already occupying space, it's going to be accessing resources, depleting those resources, and of course that's going to have a negative effect on other later arriving species. Predators that might be present, parasites that are already in the system, can also have a negative effect on later species arriving. So this is occupation of space is often referred to as what's called the priority effect, and that is that a site that's occupied is basically preempted by a species that established first. So, first come, first serve, basically, right? If you're there already, you're taking up space, acquiring new resources, and so you're going to prevent later species from establishing, or making it a lot harder for them to establish. So early species can make the site less suitable for later species. So again, depletion of resources, shading, and so forth are mechanisms of inhibition. The last mechanism is a neutral mechanism. This one's called tolerance, and that is essentially, as the name implies, the chance of species establishing is really only determined by dispersal ability, or their ability to just simply tolerate a particular environment. There's neither a positive nor negative effect of earlier species on later species. Hence it's a neutral type of mechanism. So the species that arrive don't really alter the environment in either a positive, that is facilitative, or negative, or in other words, antagonistic kind of way. And really fundamentally, the arrival of species, or occurrence of species in the succession, is really just simply due to their ability to disperse and establish, despite the presence of other species. Or they're simply able to tolerate, the low resource levels that might be available, or stressful physical conditions if they exist. So it really fundamentally comes down to their dispersal ability and tolerances to the conditions into which they would be establishing during the succession. So now I want to turn to disturbance and just talk about disturbances specifically. I mentioned at the start of the lecture that disturbance is a natural part of ecological systems, and that species have basically lived with disturbance over evolutionary time and have evolved adaptations that allow them to respond and be resilient to or resistant to different kinds of disturbances, depending upon the type in the particular system that they exist in. But let's first define disturbance, because disturbance is a pretty complex phenomenon, and it's worth spending a little time just talking about the definition. So a disturbance, as is shown here, is an event, usually some kind of disruptive event. Could be highly catastrophic, like a volcanic eruption, or maybe more minor, like even a tree fall or something like that. So they range quite a bit, but it's an event that disrupts population, community, or ecosystem structure, and changes resources in the system, alters the substrate availability, or the physical environment. Okay, so let's look at disturbances in terms of what kinds of elements make up a disturbance, and how those elements can actually influence ecological communities. First, plants, just kind of getting back to this notion of evolution, plants have evolved many adaptations to fire. I'm just going to point out a couple. For example, in many coniferous or pine forests, these trees have been exposed to fires over many thousands of years, and have evolved adaptations that allow them to be resilient to those effects. One of them is thick bark. Another is epicormic branching. That is just simply branching from the trunk after branches maybe have been burned and killed. New branches can resprout out of the trunk to replace them. Another is serotiny, and this actually is also an adaptation that occurs among conifers, conifers being trees that bear cones. These two cones sitting here actually are cones that were dropped from, and I didn't put them there, by the way, although it might look like it. This was in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey, and these are cones from pitch pine. Pitch pine is one of many different species of pine that produces pine cones that initially, once they're mature, are sealed shut with resin. You may know that cones are the structure of pine trees where the seeds are located, and But in areas where fires occur fairly frequently, the trees produce cones that are initially sealed shut with resins, and only when a fire passes through and heats up the cones to a sufficient temperature will those resins melt, and the cones actually, because they're under pressure, the cone scales are under pressure. Once that resin melts, those cones pop open and the seeds are able to be released into the environment. And of course, the environment after fire would be one in which the canopy has been burned away, there's a lot more light, less competition, and nutrients are more readily available. So this is the phenomenon of serotiny, and it's an adaptation to fire. Another adaptation is resprouting. So many different species, especially here in California, many of the shrub species like chamise and manzanita and so forth, they resprout from the base. After a fire has burned away the top of the above ground portion of the shrub, there are buds within the base of the plant, sometimes slightly below the ground or in burls, that will be able to resprout and quickly reestablish the plant in a relatively open situation with low competition. Highlight again all the kinds of conditions I just described under the phenomenon of serotiny. So plants have many different adaptations. These are just a few that I thought I'd share with you in relation to fire, because of course here in California we have a lot of fire, and most plant communities in California have most species in many communities of California have some kind of adaptation to fire. Disturbances are characterized by three attributes, and each of which influences one another and has important impacts on communities. The three attributes are size, frequency, and intensity, and these three different factors actually interact with one another, and taken together they're referred to as a disturbance regime. So any particular in any particular ecosystem that experiences disturbance like fire or flooding, hurricanes, storm activity, and so forth, the disturbance has a characteristic set, or a characteristic disturbance regime. So, in other words, if we're talking about fire, we'll kind of keep on that theme. The frequency of fires in terms of return interval, for example, we talked about that with the Yellowstone fire. There are certain characteristic frequencies at which fire is recurrent, and that will vary and can vary quite a bit, and the degree to which it varies can strongly influence plant community richness, composition, and so forth. Intensity can also vary quite dramatically. Some fires are very low temperature surface fires, or some get very hot and under certain conditions can jump into the canopy and become a very destructive fire. And of course, the size of disturbances can vary quite a bit. They can range from very small to enormously large. Small disturbances like, trees falling in a forest. Very, very large disturbances like fires that can cover tens of thousands of acres, or volcanic eruptions that can be, of enormous scale. And these different attributes of the disturbance regime can influence one another. For example, disturbances that are less frequent tend to be larger in size and more intense. More highly frequent disturbances tend to be ones that are smaller, and so forth. So each of these different characteristics that make up the disturbance regime they interact with one another and influence one another. So let's take a look at an example of how one of these attributes, that is frequency, can determine species composition and abundance. This example comes from the New Jersey pine barrens, and the reason I actually have a bunch of examples of the New Jersey pine barrens is because I went to school, got my graduate degree at Rutgers University in New Jersey, and I spent quite a bit of time in the New Jersey pine barrens conducting some of my postdoctoral research. This area in particular of New Jersey, the Pine Barrens, is actually a rather unusual one, and I really actually enjoyed spending a lot of time here because it reminded me of California because of the pine trees and the smells and so forth. So I got to know the area quite well, and one of the interesting aspects of this area is that it actually has it's a pretty large natural area that experiences fire quite frequently, a lot more so than other areas of New Jersey. So how does fire play out in this area, and how does it affect species composition and abundance in this area? So these three images actually are images of different locations in the New Jersey Pine Barrens that have characteristically different fire frequencies. On the top, that is an area of the New Jersey Pine Barrens that experiences very frequent recurrent fires. Usually the fire return interval in that area is less than 15 years, and this is very frequent. So the plant species that occur in this area, these are for the most part dwarf pitch pines. There are very few species that can actually tolerate fire frequencies that are that frequent, and those that do have a variety of adaptations that allow them to cope with that, with fire frequencies that are that frequent. So in areas of the Pine Barrens where fire is highly frequent, we see that it's dominated by a certain actually form of pitch pine called dwarf pitch pine. These trees are inherently dwarf, and this is not only just a phenotypically plastic trait, but it actually is genetic as well. And individual trees that occur in this area actually have a much higher incidence of serotiny. That is, again, these cones that are sealed shut until a fire comes through and softens the resins enough to where the pitch pine cones can open and release their seeds. As fire frequency becomes less in areas where the frequency is between about 20 to 40 years return interval, we see that the forests now shift to, they're still pitch pine, but they are a form of pitch pine that is not the dwarf form. And so these are much taller growing, more spread out, and so forth. So we see this shift in the types of species as fire frequency decreases. In areas where we have fire frequencies that are longer than 50 years return interval, we see that the forests become dominated by oak trees. The oaks that occur in this area are very long-lived, and so when fires occur very infrequently, that gives oak trees enough time to not only establish, but to grow to a height where they can outshade and outcompete the pitch pine trees that also occur in the area. Pitch pine are not as long-lived, and so if enough time goes by without fire, the oak trees simply outlive the pitch pine trees and overtake them and become dominant in these areas of forest. So disturbance frequency can play a really important role in determining the species composition and abundance of species in ecological communities. Okay, so that wraps up the lecture on succession.